Thank you, Jamie and Tina, for this update on the valuable work that you are doing. It's time now for our third panel. This panel will be moderated by PJ Di Giammarino from JWG Group. The panel will discuss the business benefits and opportunities around digitalization. They'll also debate the role and importance of standards and explore how to concretely get there. Let me remind you once again to use the questions function to submit questions to the panel and make the session more interactive. The floor is yours, PJ.
Thanks very much. I'm really pleased to be here with you today talking about digitalization. I spent the last 16 years of my career looking for ways to bring the industry together around regulatory change. And I think that's a key part of what's going on, but there's a much bigger picture right now. I'm, as an active standards participant and being one of the leading CDM implementers right now, I'm keen to have this panel together because this conference has been talking about a number of these issues about solving breaks at source and figuring out how to mutualize interpretation and what the role of the trade association is moving forward. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panelist, Lee Brain, joins us from Barclays. Lee, can you please introduce yourself just quickly?
Yep, sure, thanks. I'm Lee Brain, a Managing Director in the Chief Technology Office at Barclays. I'm responsible for a research and engineering function with technology topics ranging from cloud to distributed ledgers, machine learning, and even quantum computing. I represent Barclays on a few industry consortia and committees, including those hosted by official institutions and trade associations.
Thanks very much. Chris, how about you?
Yeah, my name is Chris Rayner. Work for FIS as a software engineer specialist. Been working on agency lending platforms for the last 25 years. Recently been more involved in the Agile and Scrum frameworks, and since last year been working on the pilots for the CDM, and now I'm very pleased to be involved in the minimal viable product, which is going to be worked on this year. All good stuff.
Thank you. Rod.
Hi there, I'm Rod Jordan, Head of Business Development at HQLAX. I've been with HQLAX for now 2 years, working on our DLT collateral platform. And prior to that, I've been working with the Deutsche Börse Group on a settlement and primarily a tri-party role.
Thanks very much. Theon.
Yeah, thanks, PJ. So I'm Theon Ackland. I've been at Goldman Sachs for the past 10 years, and the first 6 of those I actually spent within operations supporting our derivatives businesses. And for the last 4 years, I've been working within our data modeling team, looking at how we can build data models not only for the firm internally, but also in the industry. So similar to some of the other panelists, working closely with ISDA over the last 5 years, building the CDM, and obviously now working with ISLA as they look to do similar.
Thank you. And last but not least, Akbar.
Thanks, PJ. Akbar Datu, CEO and founder of D2 Legal Technology. I'm a developer turned lawyer and now bridging the gap between the two. At D2LT, I've overseen the work on the clause library and taxonomy for ISLA and other trade associations. Thank you.
Great. So for the audience's benefit, we've been going through a bit how to tell this digitalization story. It can get full of acronyms and very complicated. So we want to start first and foremost with a business understanding. Then we'll move through what that might mean from a change perspective, talk a bit about standards, and then talk about the transformation process and the journey ahead. We'll wind up with people's views about once digital, what's the biggest change and what does it mean to them. I guess first, just in terms of aligning terms, Akbar, I'd like to turn to you. I mean, there's a lot of confusion about the terminology out there. What's the difference between digitization and digitalization? And what does this clause library mean with regards to both of those terms?
Great question. So maybe let's start with digitization. So that's the process from converting from something that's analog to digital. So you might think about it in respect of turning from paper, something manual, to machine readable and automated. And it refers to internal optimization, typically resulting in cost savings, and lets us move away from those hard copy papers and image-based documents to something machine readable, where, for example, we can search for things of interest from our legacy portfolios. Digitalization uses the digital steps and changes actually how we do things to transform how we interact with our internal stakeholders and customers and how you engage with them. It might, for example, create a completely new digital revenue stream. Digitalization is a strategy or process that goes beyond the implementation of technology. It's a deeper, a more core and fundamental change to our operating model. So we do need digitization in order to then unlock business value, and that is essentially what we then refer to as digitalization. And I guess just coming to your question then about the clause library, and maybe if I just set some of the scene for that. So ISLA have done some fantastic work through the GMSLA documentation for securities lending. It first published in 2000, and it's been a pivotal part of the growth of the securities lending industry, promoting best practices and processes. And today we have three preprint versions. We have the 2000, the 2010, and the 2018 that forms that library suite, helping with legal certainty, clarity, and efficiency. One way of looking at it is that securities lending transactions are essentially a series of contractual obligations created by the written word and forming a contract between the parties. And, what are you looking at? You're looking at the GMSLA preprint that I've discussed, but that's coupled with any relevant schedules and annexes that the parties may have put together. And even going further than that, transaction-specific terms that they may have agreed in various ways. But it's all really analog. It's words rather than data. In a world where increasingly systems and data are really the only way to scale and meet both business needs and also regulatory demands. The clause taxonomy and library for the GMSLA is really the game changer to try and address that, bringing legal, if you may, or documentation to the digital party, allowing connectivity from the documents to actual downstream business processes across various areas. So, resource optimization from capital, liquidity, collateral, regulatory concerns, so SFTR or living wills, for example, or operational management. It's the way in which we can connect the documentation to all of those different pieces.
So Akbar, if I hear you right, it's about introducing meaning into the digital context that allows you to be able to process according to a common set of rules. Is that right?
Correct, but it's a common jargon in which the documentation can then link to our downstream processes and systems. That today the two operate in a very separate manner.
Yeah, which has always been the problem. You have lots of bits of paper, but you can't link them to the processing systems. Lee, I want to come to you because you've read a lot of research out there. 3 billion pounds of cost saving from deduplication. This must be music to your ears. How do you look at this this new development of the clause library?
Yeah, sure. It's great. So in summary, where does that 3 billion figure come from? So it goes back to the genesis of the CDM. So when ISDA was running the Market and Infrastructure Technology Oversight Committee, so MITOC, it asked its members where costs could be stripped out from post-trade. And the 3 billion figure actually corresponded to if you could construct standards, adhere to those standards, and also improve technology. And by that, I mean rationalization, reduction, where you may have duplications. And just to give one example, if you look at interest rate swaps, that may be stored over 20 times in different instances across the industry. And every time there's an event occurring, it may be necessary to update that instance of the data and then potentially reconcile that as well. So much of that could be stripped away from these new mechanisms. You need the foundation of a common data structure. You then need the next layer of a common process. And then finally, you also need to be able to remove the redundant duplication of the instances. And it's when you combine those three things together is when the magic starts to happen and you're able to get the huge cost reduction. So from our bank's perspective, this is clearly a priority, and we've been engaged in this for a few years, and we're looking to work closely with market infrastructures to deploy these types of initiatives. And the 3 billion save is achievable in the longer term.
Yeah, and I guess to give us a sense for that 3 billion, how much of it ties back to regulatory mandates where you're going to have to do it anyway? It's just you need to do it better and you get the cost down.
Yeah, there are some elements, for example, that tie to reporting. So if you've got the common reporting format and some emerging technologies, you're able to peel off the information. So you can treat it almost as pull rather than push, and that then simplifies things. So that helps. But I would say earlier in the life cycle, not just regulatory, I would just say it's the way things have been built over the decades has inevitably led to duplication. And that duplication includes a high degree of variance. So particular processes, same process, but implemented in slightly different ways using slightly different technologies. All of that needed to be maintained over time, results in all the broker dealers effectively performing the same piece of work. In many other areas, it would be rationalized away. For example, browsers. We don't all build our own browsers. There's industry solutions that build, and then we deploy them internally. So we're looking forward to a model where that could happen. You need quite a few building blocks to get there, but the standardization is the most fundamental of those building blocks.
Yeah, and I guess there's a key element to this of when we built the infrastructure out, we were just reacting to the needs of the time, and things like regulatory came along and defined a need for a price or a timestamp that related back to the interest rate swap. We didn't quite know what it all was, so we developed another data source, and we tried to then export that to everybody. And of course, everybody did it differently. So I can see, particularly for those regulatory mandates, there's a real need to tie these things together. But obviously that helps the whole business, and the more you can get the business defining those terms up front, the less of a problem you have in being able to extrapolate and get it out the door to the regulator. Theon, I wanted to come to you because you have some really interesting things going on in the open source domain. Pioneering Legend. How do you see the digitalization in the reference data space, and how does that play in here?
Yeah, thanks. So Legend, just to give people a little bit of a background, is a data management toolkit that was created within GS, but open sourced last year through Finos, who are part of the Linux Foundation. So definitely go and find out more that way. But basically, as a data management toolkit, it allows us to explore, describe, find, and share data. And specifically on that describe piece, the first part of Legend that we open sourced was Studio, which allows us to model data. And we've been talking about already that need for standardization, sort of that build of industry standards. And what we did last year with Legend was actually show that we can sort of accelerate that build of industry standards using Legend. So it's a very user-friendly GUI, drag and drop ideas, getting the business and engineers aligned together to do this. And then the other part of it also is it allows us to map multiple standards together. So we might be able to map, say, from FPML that exists today to CDM, or from the ISO standards into the CDM. And equally, for people wanting to use those industry standards, is to be able to map some of their proprietary models to that and allow us to sort of get there perhaps quicker.
Excellent. So you can take the same reference databases, both public and private, and tie them to the core business processing, as well as validating what's going out the door to the regulators.
Exactly. And so we sort of use it internally, we use it across all of those spaces, and making sure that we've sort of got a standard model. And as we sort of think about it, the consumers of that model downstream are using that same piece of data. And to the extent we can make that similar to the standards in the industry and sort of speak across the industry using those same standards, we all gain from those benefits.
Yeah. Because clearly, something like the common domain model has come along since Goldman had its own internal model. You're not talking about replacing your internal model with the common domain model, but you're going to map the two, right? And it's that translator between it, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Excellent. So, Rod, I want to come back to you around because there's parts of this industry I'm less familiar with, like around tri-party agents. And we talked about this a bit before, but obviously, there are big benefits to the way the business gets done today. How do you see them?
Yeah, I think the standardization and the CDM can help a lot. I think one of the areas which is particularly problematic today, which could benefit from a little bit of an upgrade, is the eligibility schedule domain. So this is this industry of setting up all the different rules, eligibility, haircuts, concentrations to achieve the right collateral allocation baskets. It's very operationally intensive. It tends to be quite static and takes some days sometimes to get right. It's overcomplicated for what it is. And this is where I think standards can really help to firstly standardize the reference and the terminology for the various attributes of securities. I think in eligibility rules you're looking at 50 to 100 different categories and classifications, and I would bet some money that they're not always the same across every tri-party agent. And so to characterize securities and also to express the rules for these various eligibility criteria in a standard way would be very beneficial. How would that really change things? At the moment, those rules could be built and tested somewhere else and then passed to the tri-party agents to be implemented. They could also be used in the kind of optimization process to say, well, look, if I can apply these rules on my portfolio, I can then work out what I would need to move to the long box for it to be used correctly and better manage my collateral movements there. I think even from a trading perspective, what I've seen recently in recent demonstrations of trading platforms is much more integration of defining rules about what is actually being traded. And I think, again, if those were correctly captured in the right format and standardized, then as well as sending an RQV to the tri-party agent, you could also package up the rules and get away from that static setup and move to a more dynamic model. Why I'm so interested potentially is because of HQLAX is in the business of enabling baskets of securities to become very mobile. We rely on the underlying tri-party agents to implement all those rules and get those baskets correctly set up. And if we can actually attach these eligibility rules to the baskets, potentially then they can be rehypothecated and people understand what's in these baskets of collateral and are better able to price them and reuse them.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating opportunity, right? Because something like that is not just for the big boys. I mean, this isn't something that benefits to only the largest players, because even the smallest players can get benefit from this as well, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's where the standards, and that's where we really need ISLA to really help bring everyone together and make that happen. And I think it's a benefit to everybody, and especially to the optimization domain.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd like everyone to think about that, the difference about who wins and are there any losers here for a second. I want to come back to that. But Chris, I'd like to draw you in here. How are you looking at these new standards transforming the current offerings that are out there?
Well, it's quite interesting because most of the time people ask about the future offerings. So it's quite interesting to be asked about what we've got currently available. How's it going to change everything we have now? And I think, to be honest with you, as standards get, as we need to integrate standards into our existing products, it's more about using existing technology which we have. So, for example, most of our agency lending products that I've been working on, we will have very robust data integration tools actually built into the system already. So to actually adhere to a new standard is relatively straightforward. It's not actually going to require a huge amount of new development to actually integrate into the CDM. So I think from current offerings perspective, it's actually not much of a large hit. So I think a lot of people will be able to get started with the CDM very quickly. So from that perspective, it's going to help us, I think, reduce the amount of time we have to do on integration projects, and that'll actually give us more time to work on new product ranges, for example, do more innovation, spend less time on getting products to actually talk to each other, because we won't need to worry so much about the data at all. I think as the new standards get implemented as well, we'll see more transparency with the data. Everyone's all going to have the same setup, so we'll all be able to understand and interpret each other's data. And as Lee just said, you've got the same representation, the same trade, for example, represented in 20 different ways on different people's systems. So if we're all representing it in the same way, then we don't have to worry about reconciliation so much. There'll be less breaks. Everything should be a lot easier to sort of communicate back to each other, and counterparts won't have to worry so much about, as I say, doing the reconciliation. I think it's also coming back to a point Theon made as well. Actually, it's an interesting point that the CDM allows you to map data from your own internal format to the CDM preferred format as well, which is JSON at the moment, but it's extending to other data types. So you don't actually have to reinvent the wheel. The CDM can actually recognize your data types for you just by creating a mapping file. So again, it's a very low cost of entry to get to start using the CDM and realizing the benefits of CDM very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess that's something someone just picked up on a chat. I want to come back to Theon on it, but the question is, how important is it in Islaland that this CDM has been architected already for SFTs and for the ISDA portfolio? I guess, Theon, what's your view? I mean, are these benefits more obtainable because we've got more traction across the various asset classes?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think what the benefits we can gain sort of from what's been done so far is around the principles that we've set up into the CDM. So on the back of the MyTalk, as I think Lee mentioned, sort of that principle of what do we want the CDM to do has been set up. We've gone through a number of iterations, as we said, through some of the derivatives products already. And so those are very well understood. And some of those are sort of the idea of building blocks of payouts or describing our event functions, some of those things that haven't been done yet in the industry, we've already had a chance of doing over the last few years. And so I think as we move into new products, it's only going to get easier as we start to just sort of bring them in line with those principles, for sure.
Yeah, and is there an element of drag and drop or cut and paste from asset class to asset class?
Yeah, absolutely. We're definitely reusing data. So when we talk about payouts, if we're trying to sort of build derivative products, a number of products use an interest rate payout as the base. And so we don't have to go and redefine that. It's simply just the calculation of a cash flow that's needed there using a fixed rate or a floating rate. And so to the extent that's reusable, we absolutely just pull that straight in.
Yeah, so it really helps if we have an industry of digitizers that understand how to take current practice and model it. But then to be digitalizers, we need to figure out how to plug it all together. So, Lee, I wanted to come to you in terms of these business opportunities. You've talked about this end to end and the 3 billion, and how do you see this transformation happening? Can we really get to entering data once by 2025?
I would say that's the goal. So we need a long-term aspiration and a vision. And about 3-4 years ago, we demonstrated a prototype, which was exactly that. And the idea was to inspire. And we showed it going right the way from entering the master agreement details, annexes, editing, entering trades with the economics, constructing the confirms, right the way through to the performance of the contract. And right the way through that, it was the same data. So the data you enter once and it passes through. There's a degree of elegance in that solution. It also enables you to be able to buy from different vendors, knowing it's compatible, and then also to squirt out the results into whether it's reporting or different execution platforms. So that vision makes great sense. The challenge is, where are we at the moment? There's process debt across the industry, technical debt as well. So we have to construct a roadmap, and each stepping stone needs business value. So even though it takes only 10 minutes to identify 101 candidate use cases where this could work, it actually takes a lot longer to construct a viable business case with a stepping stone where a sufficient quorum of participants is able to land. And for that roadmap to have integrity as well, meaning each step in the journey takes you towards that vision. So our approach for this has been often working with market infrastructures as a coordinator, together with other market participants, to tease out where those stepping stones lie. And there are obvious big wins in the major product classes, and there are also other wins that are maybe quicker to achieve, faster to market, where you're looking at more greenfield opportunities. And my observation has been there's been great appetite for deploying these, making the most of the latest technologies. But in order to do it right, I would say for the long term, we need the appropriate standards as the base. And this idea of, do you map to your own internal standard? And there are various variations of FPML within each institution where it may be enriched. Or do you look where your core data is itself CDM? And I think each institution, as the years go by, will have an opportunity to consider how deeply they integrate with that purist model. And it may well be that the initial stepping stone is, for example, you just have existing APIs and you're taking the data, doing some mappings in and out. It may be the market infrastructure starts off by hosting the pure model. And actually, you start to get more synergies and more benefits when you yourself integrate more deeply with that model. And it's in a number of different ways. It's not just the internal data store, but it's also if you imagine the event steps that occur and mapping your own institution to those. And then it may be even looking a bit more radically, other technologies such as distributed ledgers that may help you with the synchronization. So your own institution could be synced up automatically in terms of the internal model. Again, all of this, as you can imagine, will take time to play out, which is why we spend so much time trying to tease out what are those viable business cases and the stepping stones to get there.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that it really has to happen at the infrastructure level before you can really adopt at each of the financial institutions. I've got questions come through in the chat about the inevitable DLT adoption rate, and I liken it to many of the regulatory reporting papers I've seen. There's one from the BIS that came out in December, looked at 10 different initiatives going on with regulators for reporting. They had one footnote about an actual DLT case where one regulator is looking at how to get data from anybody. I think there really has to be some element of compulsion for people to go on these stepping stones that you're laying out. I kind of get it down to when I was a COO for technology, either legal was yelling that it had to happen, or the regulator was going to yell if we didn't do it. Who's really yelling for DLT? Is anybody really looking for it all happen there?
Yeah, so I've seen broker dealers that are looking into the future, and there are a number of reasons to look at this. They range from, for example, more visionary aspects such as distributed FMIs. So that model where it's more of a peer-to-peer connection model, and the FMI as an operator is coordinating the activities for the participants to trade peer-to-peer. That's just one of the potential avenues. But I think to make it more real, you need these stepping stones. So without going into too much detail, if we look at the technology architecture aspects, you can imagine, for example, a financial market infrastructure hosting all of the distributed ledger nodes for a set of participants on day one. Those participants accessing via APIs, they're not even aware that behind the scenes, there's a distributed ledger running. You can imagine a step two. You have access to those nodes that third party hosts on your behalf and you can monitor them. Step three, you're managing them, but that third party is hosting them. Step four, you can maybe bring the nodes in-house and then get various benefits from that. Although it would be more complex, you'd have extra hosting challenges. And I think it depends on each individual institution, how fast or slow they want to go down that journey. But it then means it's incumbent onto the market infrastructures to provide the optionality. So wherever you are down that journey, you can still connect with that central service, whether it's actually technically deployed in a distributed way or not. So that's a vision I could imagine happening with those market infrastructures that have appetite to go down that journey.
It sounds like a really slow vision, to be frank. I guess, Akbar, I want to come back to you because I'm not hearing the legal community yelling, and I guess that I'm looking for some herd mentality, people wanting to adopt and seeing a real benefit here. What you're doing could be fundamental to the efficiency and effectiveness of the legal function. How much are you getting pulled from the legal functions?
So there's not enough yelling. There's not enough movement on this, I think is fair to say. But the problem is just getting bigger and bigger, right? I mean, I think what we've seen is, whereas the areas that the terms in the documentation kind of cover has remained constant, we're seeing an ever increase in the number of variants of specific clauses that we have in the document. So the time it takes to negotiate terms or onboard clients and find relevant terms is getting harder and harder, and there just isn't that standard, and maybe the legal and documentation teams are drowning enough that maybe don't have time to yell. Sometimes those variances are rightly there in order to accommodate the different circumstances. But I think, unfortunately, what we've seen over the last 2 decades is something different. We've seen a lot of cases where the documentation differs because of house style. 2 different documentation teams or lawyers that have drafted it. In some cases, they've said in the documentation that both buyer and seller shall do X, Y, Z. And in other cases, they simply say both parties shall. Clearly achieving the same outcome, but 2 different people, in this case, quite a simplistic thing, but saying it in completely different ways. And sometimes we document highly bespoke bilateral contractual obligations, forgetting that there's really no chance of downstream systems accommodating, for example, some of the collateral or provisions or rating downgrade provisions, etc., that we might kind of put in. And we're really stunting the growth of platforms downstream to help manage payments, collateral, capital, risk, regulatory reporting. I mean, the list is endless, right? And we're almost creating a need for exception management downstream because there isn't those standards in terms of the way in which we express the contractual obligations and what they sought to achieve. And actually to the point where, yes, there is a need for bespoke provisions in certain cases, but the cost of then maintaining that is significantly outweighing the benefit of that kind of bespoke wording. And it makes it really, really difficult to link a contract to the downstream systems and what they must do due to kind of what's in there. And that's because there's just no legal agreement data standards with which to make that link. And again, just coming back to the clause taxonomy that ISLA have taken a wonderful step in terms of trying to kind of push that forwards. What it does is it enumerates for each clause within the document what the defined business outcomes of it are, so we can build on it and provide that functionality. And I can see it dramatically improving the way we think through things such as netting, for example, and linking a master trading agreement to the relevant industry legal opinion that, for example, ISLA may have coordinated and got for a particular jurisdiction and counterparty type, and ensuring that any amendments to the agreement that are needed, as may be mandated in that netting opinion, are contained within the agreement. And so, for example, in that case, what you'll typically see in those legal opinions is this requirement that, for example, for a particular jurisdiction or counterparty type, you need to amend the definition of act of insolvency in order to achieve that positive netting determination. And that's kind of the key to, for example, the work that one does in the clause taxonomy to then realize the benefits of it. I mean, PJ, the question you asked just now, and Lee, you touched on in terms of the path to smart contracts and use of DLT. I mean, as you'll see, we're a long way behind in documentation and legal, right? And to some extent, without this standardization, I fear that we'll move to a world where we're automating and we're automating, but we've just got no idea what we're automating. We need to take those baby steps and get that sorted out.
Yeah, I absolutely hear you, and I think, Theon, I'd like to come back to you because this touches on a key point. Within your empire and in the larger discussion around Legend, how much push or pull internally do you have from your legal and compliance teams to start re-architecting the way they're describing their business requirements in the language of the CDM, or using the libraries and building blocks that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been sharing a lot internally, actually. And I'd say sort of, obviously, we've been working on this for the last 5 years, 4 or 5 years with ISDA. I'd say in the last 2 years, we've really started to see that and sort of have an internal group of people that meet on a regular basis to see how this is tracking. Across all of the stacks, actually, including sort of the margin and collateral, that's really moving. The regulatory piece was really what the driver was to get started. So they're very keen to see where we can go in this space. And that obviously includes all of our legal and compliance parts to that. I think there's also beginning to be a driver also from the business side, which is an interesting shift. I think a lot of the conversations that happen here are around more of that consumer layer, what happens after the trade, lots of what we're talking about now. But actually, we're starting to also see the business being interested in this, because actually, if we can help, and at the bottom line is sort of bring the businesses faster, then we can really help them to do more business as well, right? So they're getting more interested in everything that's happening downstream for them in this space as well, which I think has been an interesting transition over the last few years for us.
Yeah, I mean, so now as a COO for technology, you've got my interest, because I can satisfy multiple stakeholders within the organization by putting that one headcount on something that says CDM. I guess, Lee, coming back to your shop, what's that conversation like? And are you seeing that the business is proactively wanting to adopt the CDM for business purposes?
Yeah, so we've actually been going very much into the business cases. So we spent about two years looking at prototypes, assessing candidate areas, but it's progressed now. And we are involved in new initiatives that are looking at deploying the CDM as one of the core data structures and process standards within it. So within each institution, there'll be certain drivers. For ourselves, there are high-value ops opportunities, and that's our approach for this. It's all about improving the operations and then constructing the business case to be able to support that. There are other ones. So I've, for example, seen initiatives where they're looking at more greenfield, and in those cases, the idea of getting the business sponsorship and so on lined up is key. I think it's going to move from almost product type, asset class as it spreads. So this is going to be a slow growth standard. And I think what's going to be key is identifying where you have this willing group of participants, the minimal viable quorum of participants to drive out in a particular case. That's key. The next point is to get it at the right point of the life cycle of the project. For example, if the project's already been proposed, 3/4 built and so on, and then you come along with the CDM, how late is it to backfit into that? So I think there'll be an element of serendipity for different initiatives that are evolving across the industry anyway. I mentioned market infrastructures before, and I think they're key for coordinating across the industry. If there isn't a market infrastructure in place for a particular initiative, then that may in itself construct challenges looking for the participants to self-coordinate. So my observation would be in the retail space, that's a harder problem to solve compared to in the markets post-trade, where it's the natural setup for the ecosystem. With Rod here in HQLAX, obviously they're aligning with the market infrastructure for their initiative to deploy, help speed to market. And I think that applies across the board.
So Lee, we've had a question come in. We've been talking, and it mirrors my own thinking, which is this all sounds very theoretical. Give me 3 examples. What are 3 things I should be doing right now in this space? While you're thinking about that, Theon, why don't you jump in and give us your answer?
Yes, I think from my angle, in terms of getting involved in this, it's actually getting into those conversations of building these standards. I think sort of to date, we've had a number of participants obviously being helped by the industry bodies, but now we have some of these in an open source environment. We have that ability for many more people to get on board and to start contributing, and that's how we're going to be able to get these standards to actually come to market a lot quicker, and make sure that actually when they come to market, and we call them complete if that's possible, that we've had all the views at the table, and so that they are actually a true representation of what we need. So for me, it's about sort of getting involved, getting those standards built, and then having a think about how you're going to start to actually drive that from your perspective, and sort of being able to bring people on board to those standards.
And do you have any particular examples of where you're working to get those standards adopted, and how there's a business case for it this year?
Yeah, so we're actually through Finos and sort of using Legend at the moment. We're helping to develop the commodities part of the CDM. So obviously that's derivatives specifically, but we're also working on some product controller side of the business as well. So completely different to the CDM, but actually looking at how do we build those standards for price transparency at the controller level. And so that's really being driven by a number of the key banks, but also we have the vendors in that conversation as well. And if we can reach a standard template, that's going to make it much easier for the industry to work on. So that's an example that we're working on at the moment outside of the CDM.
How about anybody else? Anyone else have a real business case for doing something in the next 18 months?
For ourselves, we're heavily promoting interest rate swaps. It's an area we've been developing smart contracts, working on the CDM development. Obviously, Barclays is big in the interest rate swap space, and it's for vanilla products. It's a good start. Just in terms of ways to get involved, I'll just emphasize one of the key things is to play with this technology. Download the CDM, download some of the code developments that come out of Regnosis, and try using it. Your developers will get the experience. They'll learn leading edge new technologies. They'll enjoy it, and your firm will get experience in this space. And related to that is connecting to fintechs. I was mentioning market infrastructures, but often it's the market infrastructures and the banks hooking up with the fintechs that are building these solutions. And it's a really interesting world now with this. In the last few years, where you have these fintechs at the leading edge building this, and they need to partner with the broker dealers and vice versa in order to build these solutions out. So I think constructing that broader ecosystem. And if you look at the working groups for this, where you've got the mix of financial institutions and the fintechs working together to build the solutions.
Right. Well, I don't think any of your business cases beat mine, but so I just like to plug the fact that if you have a derivatives business that has to report to a regulator for mere refit or Part 43, 45 of Dodd-Frank for CFTC, you come on and get involved with the Global Derivatives DRR program that we're running. We've got a dozen firms in there, buy side and sell side. They're actually training up. We'll have 20 digitizers by May that are actually looking to figure out how do we model and how do we use the CDM for the purposes of regulatory reporting. So it's a great way to actually do something we have to do anyway, and get the benefit of mutualizing for regulatory reporting. So I'll put that on the list as well. But I guess this role of standards gets very, very interesting because I sit on a number of standards bodies. There is no way to standardize the language of finance. The CDM can hold it, but who is the arbiter of how we define the interest rate swap model? And what does this all mean? And I guess that's a really new space and interesting. Akbar, I want to come back to you. Is how do we encourage adoption of common practices, and who helps with the standards?
So, I mean, when it comes to the legal agreement, it forms one piece of the CDM, and the initial steps that we need to do is really asking people to really engage as part of the clause taxonomy and library working groups that ISLA have set up. We meet weekly at the moment. We're going through the clauses in the GMSLA. And what's key to a success of this project is to get visibility of the variants that are used by market participants today. And then we can ensure where we're placing these standards are in the right place. To date, we've had great participation across the market in terms of provision. People have been sending in templates, playbooks, example clauses. But, I don't think we can have too many of those, and if anything, it will validate that we are putting those standards in the right place. And of course, adoption will be so much easier with that input if you've been providing where you currently, the way people currently draft things today within the document. And I guess the next step to then help with that adoption is if we've got those business outcomes defined in the taxonomy, well, the clause library then provides for each of those enumerated business outcomes model wording that you can then use to get that standardized way of drafting for the same outcome. In terms of adoption, I mean, actually, probably worth looking at the ISDA project. So we worked on a clause taxonomy and library project for ISDA that started in 2018 and worked through their master agreement and collateral agreement. So, slightly kind of ahead in time in terms of, the number of groups and the standards that have been laid down. And I guess really there one's seen that, market participants, firms have been taking their templates and actually now not just seeing it as a standard, but actually picking it off the shelf and actually updating their language to make sure that it is being embraced. So, the documents are now being upgraded, the model wording is being used, and then this is allowing, document generation tools, negotiation platforms, document data extraction tools to flourish within the using the clause taxonomy and library. And also it then allows us, kind of linking this through. I mean, people listening may be thinking, well, you've got this kind of clause taxonomy and library. How does that link into the CDM that everyone else is talking to? Well, the CDM is then going to define the various events and conditions that actually start off being talked about within those contracts itself. And then we can, look at our legacy contracts. Now, we won't have had a chance to use the model wording there. The legacy contracts are what they are, right? We have to live with what we've agreed there. But we can now look back at those and say, well, let's understand how we might represent them or look at them using the lens of this common jargon. And that then allows us to utilize AI tools. I think the big problem, and some firms have dabbled with using NLP or AI tools to try and find relevant terms within their documents. But in some cases, those have been really expensive exercises for little business benefit, because we're trying to train these tools, but we've actually been the worst trainer possible because, we're inconsistent in terms of how we train those tools. We're kind of, marking it using a different mark scheme. We change it kind of every day when we start to kind of look at the output. So really, this is starting to draw out the vision, the dream of where we might get to through these standards.
Yeah, I love the notion of poorly trained AI. I guess, Chris, I want to come back to you on this, because there's an Italian saying about from where we are now to where we want to go, there's an ocean in between. And we have all that legacy that we're dealing with all those bad practices. Now we're talking about introducing digitized or digitalized practices. How do you get there?
Well, the first step really is to get the standards, get the standard consistent data. Once we've got the data sorted, get the functions and events all standardized as well, which is what the CDM is doing really now, providing governance over how the CDM is then maintained, make sure that everyone's following the same guidelines. And then we start changing basically how we actually pass the data to each other, which is all moving towards, as Lee said, the DLT, blockchain, smart contracts, moving all into the more distributed architectures rather than having it all based on like a one sort of central database that you have installed on your own server, and everybody else's data is completely different. So I think that's how we're going to move forward once everything's all digitalized. So yeah, it's moving away from the older sort of central authority and making everyone has their own versions of the same data.
Chris, what's your view? I mean, how do we get there?
I know you think it's a slow vision, but I think it is still a vision worth slowly walking towards. Lee said implement it incrementally, and I think that's a very good way to go. If we try and change everything instantly, I don't think it's going to happen. A lot of people will resist, and I think particularly it's going to be better to get more people involved. We'll have more adoption if we do it in a slowly, methodical manner rather than trying to say, okay, tomorrow we're going to change everything to be like this. So I think doing certain sections of the business, perhaps doing, well, in fact, actually, we're already seeing it happening, aren't we, with HQLAX already adopting DLT for their collateral optimization. So I think, we're already beginning to see the slow steps towards I guess, the future we're all aspiring towards, a digital future.
Rod, would you concur with that?
I think Akbar made a very good point about sharing our own data to the people doing the standards, such that those standards can be complete and have input from everybody. I think that's something that we probably could all do better. And so I think in the example we talked about, sharing eligibility schedule information. It's only when you have a complete set can you really have something that is going to be usable for everybody and standardized. So yes, I agree.
Fantastic. Okay, Theon, I want to come back to you, I guess, in terms of moving on to rounding out this discussion. We only have 8 minutes left. Amazing how quickly this has gone. But what in your view, is the place that needs the biggest push? I mean, yes, I'm being skeptical about the pace of change, but at least we're having this conversation, and at least there are things that have happened in the last 5 years. What's the big push that's needed now?
Yeah, I think what we need to see is the industry vendors and service providers starting to pick this up. I think there's an ease in sort of each bank and working with their clients and perhaps improving that incremental communication using standards. But I think for us to start to see this really develop and grow, we need to see sort of those vendors and services starting to use these standards, get people speaking this way. And if they start to sort of pick this up, we're going to get everyone starting to follow. And as we sort of see those benefits come through, everyone will then obviously pick up and gain the benefits too. So I really think it starts with sort of people who are connectors in the industry, perhaps is the right way to put it, although it doesn't stop individuals starting to use it ahead of time and sort of speaking with clients in that way.
Sounds like you're going to make a phone call to procurement soon and get them to start introducing new questions into their vendor surveys every year. Good. I like it, Lee. Where's the big push needed at under the Blue Eagle?
Well, for ourselves, I actually think we've already started the push. We're already there. We're already bought in to developing the standards, identifying the use cases and business cases. As I mentioned, I think as this year progresses, you'll hear more about those industry initiatives that just happen to be using the CDM. That's the point, when you'll know it's landed, when there's another initiative that just happens to use it. And I would say, from our perspective, getting those operational efficiencies elicited, articulated, and understood fully by the executives allows us to move forward. That's going to be the leverage. It's not going to, the business case isn't dependent on a technical definition of a standard or similar. So I think this point of tying together multiple participants in an ecosystem so it becomes inevitable that you would use this as a standard. As I mentioned, the challenge I think is going to be where there isn't a natural market infrastructure or similar for a particular product or use case, and how to drive it forward in the absence of that. There are opportunities that may include, for example, constructing new entities, and a group of key participants get involved in strategic investment to help spin it up. There's all different ways that these things could be made appetizing to different participants. And I think it's those business elements that are going to be really actually driving it forward. They just happen to use a CDM.
Robustly defendedly, I think I hear pushback on my assertion in the sense that, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. So maybe that's where we are with CDM, and we just have to see it, emerge. Akbar, what's your perspective? You hang out with lots of devils. Where do you see the push needed?
I think we need to really close the gap, right, in terms of engagement from the legal function, the documentation teams, and embracing, the role that this will all play from it. Well, as we've said before, right, we're running a decade kind of behind everyone else, right, and we need to start playing our part in terms of that digitalization kind of journey. If I can say, provocatively, well, what have we been doing for 20 years, right? I mean, since the publication of preprints in 2000, have we actually changed how we do things and facilitated an ability to link between the documents and the trades together, and really across the clause taxonomy, library, and CDM, by defining the events, conditions, that are contained within these contractual obligations. This is our moment, really, to try and make something better of it.
Thank you. We're running short on time. I'm going to take that as your closing statement. Theon, I'll turn to you. Once digital, what business is going to change the most, and what's that going to mean? 60 seconds.
I think for me, I'll have to go back to my roots of when I started out in the industry. I think it's going to be sort of improving that reconciliation, that communication with clients, all of that downstream processing that happens today. I think that's where we're going to see a really big input, and it probably wouldn't go without saying, not to mention regulation as well. I think that'll be the big places we see big change.
Thank you. Rod, what's your view?
Yep, I think it's in the optimization space that we'll see some clear benefits there, specifically in the collateral domain. So, yep, that's why I'm pushing for that one.
That's why you're here. Thank you, Chris.
I think basically virtually every business would be touched by this, to be honest. I think the question really is which one's going to be touched first, and that's kind of down to what the industry decides. I think really whoever gets on with it first. And I think if I was to make a guess, I would say collateral optimization, possibly settlements would be getting onto smart contracts.
Okay, so the two potential stepping stones. Lee, you've spoken a lot about the different use cases, but what in your view, where's the biggest impact once digital?
Well, if you look at the life cycle in terms of the impact, I'd say post-trade has the biggest bangs for the buck in terms of if you optimize there, what's the percentage improvement? It could be in the order of about 60-70% reduction in cost in terms of removal of inefficiencies. Legal could similarly have big percentages, although the absolute numbers in terms of benefit there are smaller compared to the post-trade. But other things could transform the nature of the time for things to occur. So, for example, if you're thinking of lending broadly and syndicated loans and how long it takes to construct syndicated lending across multiple parties, just some basic, simple standardization and process automation could improve and reduce those times enormously. You start adding on the standardization as well, and you're able to optimize it further. So I think there's a world of opportunity for these improvements. The question is for the participants, is it a priority that's bubbling up their book of work list? And if not, how to do that and what sorts of things you need to pull together in terms of other participants to make it a no-brainer activity that you need to also be involved in if the industry is moving to this new solution.
Thanks, Lee, and thanks everybody on the panel. You've done a great job. Thanks for putting up with me. I think there's a real and compelling case. This is here. This is almost now. It's definitely something to get on your agenda, and plenty of more resources. Great paper from Isla this week. Check out the JWG website if you want to know lots of what we're doing in the reg space. But get in touch with everybody on this panel, and I'm sure they can help. So I'll cede my time back over and thank all my panelists once more.
Thank you, PJ, and to the panelists for this really fascinating discussion. Lots of opportunities out there. We'll have a break now before our last panel of today that will try to make some sense of it all and wrap up the conference. That panel will be moderated by Jonathan Lombardo from Deutsche Börse Group. Make sure to be back at 4:45. And don't forget, if you haven't done so yet, to look at the sponsors pages. Thank you.